All right, so in some sense I have 3 independent topics to talk about, so it might at first seem like 3 lightning talks, but they are connected, and you'll see as we go along how they're connected. So I've been doing some research over the past 5 to 10 years into open source and innovation, and this is partly part of my employment at multiple different companies who engage in open source, and also academic work on the side, working on a master's and now a PhD. So the real heart of this is looking into what makes companies successful, both at open source and also at technology innovation. And it turns out there's actually a lot of things in common between the two. So one of the lines of research that's relevant to this is into organizational capabilities. This is, in a sense, it's like the knowledge that individuals have at a company, but it's what abilities that the company as a whole has built into their processes, has built into their business, has built into their employees. And they can be learned over time. So it's not like any company is at a fixed point of capability and can never change, but it does take time to build up new capabilities. So it's not like you can just make a decision and the next day your company has the capability to tackle that totally new strategic area or that totally new project. But your organizational capabilities also affect your strategic outcomes. So two companies who make the exact same business decision, that is a good business decision in the market. One company may succeed and the other company may fail, because the company who fails didn't have the organizational capabilities required to achieve that strategic goal. Another line of research that's relevant here is open innovation. So this is an idea that started in about the 2000s. Henry Chesbrough was the one who started it, but it's been through a number of different iterations over the decade plus since then. And in some ways it's similar to open source, but it's not quite open source, and people get confused about that. So it's the idea that innovation in general, and this can be technology innovation, it can be business innovation, can be accelerated if companies are willing to go outside their boundaries and either share ideas they had with other companies. Possibly it's an idea that they can't profit from directly, but the other company can help them profit from it. So together they can both make more profit than if the idea just died internally. So it's sharing ideas externally, and it's also assimilating external innovation internally. So being open to ideas that other companies created and having capabilities, having processes around taking that innovation outside and building it into your own innovation internally. So this is related to open source in the sense that open source does include both of those concepts. It includes the concept of sharing your internal innovation externally and bringing external innovation internally, but it goes beyond just sharing ideas and knowledge to actually sharing source code externally and bringing external source code inside the company. So if your company is successful at open innovation, that's a capability towards being successful at open source. Maybe not all the way there, but it's a good boost to getting there. And a lot of the changes around being capable in open source have to do with thinking slightly differently about how you create and capture value for customers. So it's no longer a matter of you create all value yourself and you capture all value yourself. Sometimes it's you created some value and someone else created some more value. You created some code, someone else created some more code, and somebody else created some more code. And all together, that's a much, much bigger amount of value. You're getting much more out of that code that you all developed together than you're putting into it. So you can actually be more effective at driving innovation by not doing every single bit of the work yourself. And a big part of this as well is getting comfortable doing development in a way that is not purely under your direction. It's not purely under one company from someone up on high down through a tier of leaves to a set of individual developers. There are different kinds of relationships involved across company boundaries. So one piece of research, it actually came out of the Copenhagen Business School, so it's a little bit of local relevance, is around the levels of engagement that companies have in open source and how that impacts their success, their failure, the capabilities they need to succeed, and in a sense, ultimately, their effectiveness in open source, and their effectiveness in delivering value to their customers from open source. So it starts the lowest degree of engagement, level 1, which is basically what we call inner source. So you kind of have some collaboration ideas from open source, but you're not really doing any kind of like consuming external code or sharing code externally. You're just sort of like collaborating a little bit more like an open source model. You know, you might be using GitHub Enterprise internally, and some of your teams internally collaborate in an open source kind of way, but that's it. The second level is that you use open source, so you're purely a consumer. The third level is that you deliver open source to customers, and that can either be straight up, combined with other open source software, or combined with proprietary software. The fourth is that you lead your own open source project. So the company creates the project, they release the code as open source, but they don't really have an active external community. It's just their project that they release as open source. The fifth is companies who participate in external projects in a kind of one-directional way in some ways. They contribute code and things, but they're a little bit more distant. They're just sort of contributing code. It's an external project. They're not really actively participating, but they still get benefit from contributing contributing patches and suggestions and things like that, and getting back the source code. And the sixth way, which is the highest degree of effective open source participation, is companies who participate as co-leaders. So companies who don't just sort of throw patches over the wall at the open source project, but actively take the time to actively share their needs with the open source project, to actively advocate for the directions that they think the project needs to go. And that doesn't mean they control the project, and in fact, there's a great deal of value in having more than one company contributing ideas and together negotiating what is the best way overall for the project for the benefit of everyone involved. So you find companies participating as equals with individual open source developers and respecting them for their technical expertise and role in the project, rather than sort of expecting that, well, I'm a big company, I contribute a lot of money, so I tell you what to do. So there's some nuance here in terms of how you're effective as a co-leader in an open source project. But the biggest thing to understand is if you take that step forward, you're more effective and you get more value out of the open source project than if you just sort of passively sit back and throw patches at the project. So some other relevant research is a sort of like traditional innovation approaches where you do strategic alliances. So these would be like proprietary code, but a bunch of companies get together and under a very strong NDA and binding contracts do some development. So it's not quite open source, but some of the research around how that works and how companies do that is actually the same as the way companies participate in open source. There's a lot of similarities there, and the research is relevant. Another is standard bodies with patent pools, because the patent pools give all the companies who are participating protection from each other, so they can be more comfortable all sharing together in terms of the strategic direction and the advancement of the technology. So open source foundations often play that role, because they'll provide like a bit of patent calming within their intellectual property terms, so that the companies who are participating don't have to be afraid of each other. They can kind of lay down their arms and focus on what's best for the technology and what's best for innovation and what's going to give all the companies the best value together. Internal and outsourced R&D actually has a whole lot of similarities to open source. The way an internal R&D department would work, or the way you would relate to an outsourcing partner if you outsourced your R&D, are in fact very similar to the way that companies have to relate to each other in an open source project, or the way that a company would relate to an open source project. It's still a matter of development happening in a different group, and you have to build the same kinds of relationships across the different groups. Another relevant piece of research is licensing as acquisition. So licensing terms for technology innovation are actually an incredibly common pattern. So one company needs a piece of innovation, and so they negotiate a license with another company who has a particular piece of technology they need. The difference is that open source makes this much easier because you don't have a long process of negotiation before you get to the point that you can license that technology. It's just freely available. You can pick it up, try it under the license, and choose whether you want to integrate it or not. So in that sense, open source actually accelerates innovation because it makes it much faster and easier for companies to acquire through licensing for the specific set of technology. So a lot of my research in this, or at least some of the background research in this, has focused on, so we have all this research on technology innovation, we have all this research on open source. So what are the organizational capabilities required for both? And is there an overlap between them? So I was kind of curious just to explore. I didn't start off with an assumption. I just started off with, well, here's some interesting, let's do some mapping. Let's, sort of cross-reference between these two sets of research who, they don't often read each other's research. Just so you know, like technology innovation folks and open source folks, for some reason, they don't often talk to each other. So what I found is actually more than 100 characteristics, but these are just the top ones that I found is, in fact, the organizational capabilities required to succeed at technology innovation are a very near match to the organizational capabilities required to succeed at open source. So some of these characteristics of the two are collaboration with external communities. So, you will innovate faster if you are taking advantage of available knowledge and resources out in the open than if you decide you have to do it all yourself internally. This is also true of access to source code. Source code is one very concrete form of knowledge and resources that you can use to help your company innovate faster. The concept of sharing ideas outward. So not every idea you have internally is one that you can really take advantage of internally. And you will help accelerate the entire pool of innovation if you're willing to share those ideas outward and see if other people are willing to contribute to making sure those ideas get implemented successfully. And the other side is organizational learning. So taking in concepts from external technology innovation, but you can't just observe it. You have to have capabilities in place to assimilate that knowledge, to assimilate that code. And that is true for general technology innovation and open source. In both of them, you get an acceleration of innovation from the efficiency of reuse or modification. There's slightly different mechanics around that in proprietary technology innovation and open source. But the organizational capabilities are basically the same. Another is one particular set of authors called this strategic open source, but it's taking an approach to customer value where you're not just blindly assuming that the only way to produce customer value is to do everything yourself in-house, but really consciously examining your customers' needs, the capabilities you have, the technology you have, and strategically planning out which pieces of that can we outsource, which pieces of that should we build in-house, which pieces of that should we actually involve our customers in participation in creating that value because it will serve their needs better if they're involved. And the last one, at least of the top few, is low barrier to entry. So this is Partly in open source, it has to do with the licensing, that you can just go pick up the source code and use it. But more generally in innovation, it has to do with innovation moves faster as a whole across an industry if we aren't all working in tightly constrained silos. If every company across the cloud industry was working in a tightly constrained silo, we would pretty much have Amazon and a couple of folks who were really struggling to try to do something similar, and that's it. So the fact that we have a broad number of companies who are willing to share their ideas and work together means that the brain power, the combined brain power of all of those companies together is orders of magnitude larger than any one company on its own. So second topic, early in 2017, I took some of these ideas, some of this research, some of this background. I prepared a survey that I distributed to the OpenStack dev mailing list and other OpenStack, the board and other OpenStack. So only to OpenStack companies, but in general it was pretty broadly open. Sort of looking into what the common characteristics are within OpenStack specifically. So I was mostly targeting the platinum and gold members, but because I made it open, I actually got contributions from quite a few other companies as well. And the range of the types of companies goes all the way from startups of a few people to 380,000 people in a Fortune 50 company. So it's a pretty broad range of styles of company. And I was specifically looking to explore the nature of their investment in open source. So how do they invest in open source and where are their priorities? So one question, and you'll recognize this from the 6 levels of styles of engagement from the research from the Copenhagen Business School. One question was around what styles of engagement do you have with open source? Now, I didn't say specifically with OpenStack. So many of these companies collaborate in 100 or more different open source projects for different reasons. So this isn't just OpenStack, but just in general, what are their styles of engagement? So it ranges from inner source to use through delivering open source or proprietary software to customers, whether they engage in projects with no community, very unpopular, or some community, active community, whether they just contribute or they actually co-lead. So some interesting pieces that we get out of this is the most common styles of engagement across companies engaged in OpenStack is contributing to the community at 93% and participating as co-leaders at 91%. Now this is not what the research predicted. The research predicted specifically that these two would be the least common across companies, and a belief that the most common is, simple use or maybe distribution. The least common was open source with no community at 34%. That's radically lower than people would have predicted. Integrating open source was 82%, which was significantly more common than integrating with proprietary software at 64%, which is interesting because the research predicted that only integrating with proprietary software matters, but it turns out that actually, in terms of delivering value to customers, especially in the cloud space, the software is so complex and it involves so many different open source projects that actually just integrating the open source software and delivering that to customers in an easily integrated, consumable way is the most popular. We don't even have to get to the point of worrying about proprietary software. And actually, OpenStack provides a lot of that internally. It provides different storage drivers, it provides different compute drivers and things like that. So you don't necessarily need to do a lot of work integrating OpenStack with some proprietary software. But you do need to do a lot of work integrating all the open source software together. Another key question was around the areas of business value. So this is, where do you see the value that you provide to customers? So there's the source code, but what is it that you make money out of? And this is like integrating with software, integrating with hardware, so making it run well on particular sets of hardware, offering support or services, or software as a service. That's a valid business model on cloud. Making improvements to the software itself before you ship it to customers. Release timing is around things like an LTS, where you're doing more than what the open source project itself is doing for making releases. You're doing extra work on top of that. That was not very popular. And then domain expertise. So like you provide the expertise to the customers. You provide a place that they can go for deeper understanding of this set of code. So the most common in OpenStack companies was support at 86% and software integration at 79%. There were some interesting correlations between the two. So companies who saw their value as software integration or did software integration of either proprietary or open source components, they had a high correlation or a high tendency to consider their business value as being distributing the software. So they were doing integration and they were adding value to customers by distributing it. Companies who tended to see their engagement style as contributing, so just putting patches into OpenStack, they tended to have a higher degree of correlation with a support business model, which kind of makes sense. It's like their business is all around taking requests from customers, resolving problems, and so they contribute patches back to OpenStack, but that's about it. Companies who tended to have an engagement style around an active involvement in open source community. So it's not like there's no community, there's an active community. They tended to have a higher level of value for customers in terms of domain expertise. And companies that tended to participate in open source with no community, so they were dropping software as open source but not actually having any external community or partners, tended to have a higher correlation with software as a service business models. Which kind of makes sense if you think about it, that like the way they're making money is by delivering it as a service. They may make it as open source to make people a little bit more comfortable that the service won't like disappear if the company goes away, but they don't really have the same level of needs for external innovation from other partners. They really only care about, okay, this is a service, we're delivering it to customers. And the last set of questions were around what sets of participation practices were common. And those were whether they consider open source a strategic advantage, whether they track trends in open source, whether they share their goals externally or assimilate that knowledge internally, whether they award, so if they value participation in open source, do they reward their employees for doing an especially good job of participating in open source? And then also, if they do software integration, do they try to keep close to the upstream source so that they don't have as much work with deltas over time? Or do they just not worry about that and make whatever changes they need? The most common were open source is a strategic component of building their business. And they track open source trends, which is how they make sure they are on top of that technology innovation externally. And then also both sharing knowledge externally and assimilating it internally. The third topic, is that clock right, or because we started late?
Yeah, we started late.
All right. So the third topic, it's not very long, is also related. After doing a survey, I did a more in-depth set of interviews with board members and TC members. This was at the OpenStack PTG in Atlanta. And did a set of qualitative research analysis over those surveys and then fed that into some strategic planning that we did with the board and the technical committee and the user committee for OpenStack in March. And from that, we extracted 5 strategic areas that the 3, board, technical committee, and user committee, wanted to work on together. Community health, adjacent technologies, requirements, communication, and then evolving technology. So from the interviews, some of the strengths that we found in community health are that we do have a large and growing community, that we have strong collaboration within that community, that open governance is seen as an advantage to evolving over time because we aren't just locked into one pattern that was set in stone at the beginning, but together, collaboratively, we can improve over time. And then also the fact that we do have different companies all collaborating together means we have a much richer set of requirements and a much clearer direction to head in than if it was just one company. The way we decided we wanted to work on improving the situation is to focus on growing new community leaders. And there's been some efforts over the past few months, both by the TC and by some board members, in terms of how we mentor new cores, how we sort of encourage people to step up, how we embrace diversity of gender, of time zone, of background, of experience in terms of getting the best we can out of our community. Another area that we focused on was adjacent technologies, and in that we saw the strengths of a strong history of collaboration with other open source projects like Linux and Python and virtualization and deployment tools and orchestration tools, and that as a whole, because of the way we've structured ourselves internally as a set of separate projects, we actually have very strong integration points within OpenStack as a whole that are well tested together and work together. So the way we wanted to improve was to identify new areas that we should be focusing on in terms of collaboration with other open source projects. Containers was, of course, one of them. Edge computing came up as another one, as a very important use case for OpenStack in the future and cloud technology in general in the future. OPNFV is another one that we've already developed a good partnership with over time. And then also recognizing that we have strong integration points already built into our projects within OpenStack, and looking at ways that those can be consumed by projects that aren't necessarily entirely OpenStack every single component from top to bottom, but maybe have a different goal. Maybe using Cinder within Kubernetes or something like that. That there are places where our technology is valuable outside of a pure OpenStack cloud. Requirements, the strengths we recognized are that we have a strong culture of planning the direction of OpenStack and the work that we do in each release together. And we have a diversity of backgrounds with developers and operators and users who all bring their perspectives to the table. And the ultimate result of our work in OpenStack is always driven by real world use cases and customers and companies and organizations. And we wanted to work on sort of breaking down the barriers between developers and operators. We think we could improve there, that we could get that flow of needs communicated better back and forth between some of those diverse backgrounds. Some strengths in communication. We think we have actually done a good job of becoming more and more welcoming to people and projects in OpenStack. And we do think it's important that all the projects together collaborate to define the big picture, the direction of OpenStack. The areas we identified that we'd like to work on improving a bit is sometimes it can be a little confusing to navigate the picture of OpenStack, the pieces of OpenStack. And Terry and Lauren and a group of others have done some amazing work on making a much clearer picture that you can kind of look at in a heartbeat and you can see, I see, this is how OpenStack works. We also recognize that the phrase big tent was a little bit confusing. It's important to be welcoming, and it's important to allow for innovation that you didn't expect. So to allow for new projects to grow up, to allow for different ways of doing things to be built within the overall pattern, because otherwise you end up cemented in stone and you don't evolve and you don't innovate. But the way we did it it was a good first approximation. It really was a good way to be more welcoming, but we ended up being a little more confusing, so maybe back off from using the phrase big tent and also figure out a better way to communicate about how that works. In terms of changes to the technology, we saw some of our strengths in that OpenStack is constantly evolving. It's not like we just set out with a waterfall diagram at the beginning of the project and we delivered exactly that. We've responded to technology outside of OpenStack as it changed over time and as we were aware of new customer needs and as we were aware of new problems we could solve. And integrated new technologies from outside and also developed inside of OpenStack over time. But there was a sense that maybe with the way we've developed over time, we could do some things that might help simplify OpenStack and make it easier to consume as a technology. We've had some folks from the TC and the foundation staff working on a few things like maybe simplifying some of the configuration options and figuring out which features are like deprecated or not really necessary, things that could be removed, and keeping a smarter eye on the project list in the sense of, as things evolve over time, something that started out as a good idea, it may have dwindled off, it may have been a good experiment, but it's not ultimately where we want to go. So just keeping a more conscious idea of how we want to do that. So, 3 different topics, 3 takeaways. The first one is open source is mostly just technology innovation. If your company has developed the capabilities for technology innovation, open source is not going to be a big hurdle. There's a few new things to learn, but not actually as radically different as you might think. If you haven't really embraced technology innovation yet, there will be some challenges, but the capabilities that you have to learn to effectively engage with open source are actually mostly the same capabilities you need to learn to effectively innovate at technology anyway. So just take the hit, learn it, because it's important for your company to keep evolving over time. OpenStack, I've learned, has an unusually high percentage of co-leader companies who participate at the highest and most effective level of collaboration. That, I think maybe intuitively I knew we were a little bit unique in that way, but I didn't quite realize it until I sat down and looked at the numbers. And the fact that we have so many companies participating in that level is actually a big advantage to OpenStack. And doing things like these strategic initiatives at the board, technical committee, and user committee level is in some ways, it's a way to capitalize on that unique strength that OpenStack has, and make sure we aren't, I think sometimes there's a bit of resistance, or in the past, I've heard resistance like, oh, we don't want companies involved in our open source project. That's actually not good for the project as a whole. So recognizing that we are all participating together, that we are all co-leaders together, whether we're a company member, whether we're an individual developer, it's important for now, but it's also important for making sure we use all of those strengths to the best possible advantage over the future of OpenStack. That's it.
Thank you so much, Allison. So any questions for Allison? Right there.
Yeah, I have a question regarding the sort of your view of the general health of the OpenStack community. You brought it up. Obviously, there's been a lot of changes in the last year or two. Do do you see it improving on like short term, and what is your view long term, and what's the situation right now? If you maybe could just elaborate a little bit more around that.
Yeah, I think, over the past year, I spent a lot of time talking with folks about the changes. I think, so at first glance, it can appear somewhat negative, but if you really look at the numbers, what we've seen is not a decline. We've seen a shift from vendor participation to user participation. We have far more companies today who are users and operators who are participating in a very big way and looking to ramp up their contributions. And I think that's actually a natural evolution over time as technology commoditizes. So naturally over time, the vendors don't need as much work in OpenStack because it meets more of their needs. And so they invest less and just try to make more profit that they can off of writing on the top. But the user companies are getting more and more and more value out of OpenStack. And so they're beginning to see the benefit of participating and getting their bugs fixed and getting their needs met. So I'm not actually concerned about that. Another number that was significant to me, and I think I got it from Terry, is that of the thousands of developers that we have in OpenStack, something like 80% of the contributions come from like 300 people. And those 300 people aren't really changing. We have some flex. We have some people moving on to other things and some people coming in. And that was actually what fed into us saying, okay, instead of just focusing on bringing new contributors, we're actually doing pretty good at that. We have a lot of efforts by the foundation to like ramp up new contributors. Where we need to focus is those set of people who are contributing, but maybe they're not confident enough to take that step up to like a core or a PTL position. Sort of focusing more of our energy on that. And I think that was a really healthy realization to have. And I've also been really impressed with the work that the TC and the board have done in those areas just in the past like 6 months or so. So it's been a real focus.
More questions for Allison? All right. Thank you so much.